Today, let's talk about thought and culture between the world wars, World War I and World War II. As we all know, after World War I, Europe was in total disarray. The war had really it was a world war involving literally hundreds of nations, or at least dozens of nations, if not more than 100 nations. Totally destructive, millions dead, probably more than 10 million as a result of the war. This would have an obvious impact on what people thought, the consciousness, on art, development of culture, because simply of the destructiveness of war. A war which, incidentally, nobody had really anticipated. People called the era just before the Belle Epoque, the beautiful era. And although there were also alliance systems which were quite dangerous, I don't think that the tenor of the feeling was that such a thing as a world war was about to envelop Europe, but it did. And so European thinkers, historians, philosophers, academicians had to come to terms with what had happened. And as you can imagine, the mood was tremendous pessimism about not only what had happened, but about the future, where should people be going. And of course, right in the center of all that was Sigmund Freud, who'd been around for a while already, and now had to explain why civilization had come to sort of the utter ruins of Germany, the country that was regarded as the having so many great, brilliant philosophers. How could Germany come to this? The great Goethe and other artists and so forth and so on. And so, so the 1920s becomes the period when Freud, among others, would articulate his understanding. And Freud explained World War I in Civilization and Discontents as the sort of the failure of civilization to repress what he called the instincts of humanity, the instincts of the individual, which could be quite aggressive. For Freud, all of that had to happen as early as childhood. So Freud thought that civilization, if it were to survive, had to learn to somehow calm the instincts of the individual, who otherwise, as somebody embedded in nature also, might act out those impulses, and of course that he's talking about the impulses which led to war. So there was tremendous pessimism here too, because what could be done to ensure that war would not be the result in the future? He was not the only one. You could look around and people like the German historian, philosopher Oswald Spengler talks about the decline of the West. He thought for sure, after Europe had practically committed suicide, that other countries, other continents were sure to rise to replace the once dominant Europe. So pessimism on that front also. If you were to read T.S. Eliot, actually born right here in St. Louis, who emigrated and ended up as a citizen of Britain, Eliot writes such things as the Wasteland, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and there's tremendous pessimism here. The West has become a wasteland, difficult to know up from down, difficult to know the past from the future and where humanity can go from where it was. Civilization simply lay in ruins. So that was a very common tenor, the kind of thing that you would see from more and more artists. German expressionist art. Here you see sort of the torment of the individual being torn apart by the conflicts of what was now the modern era. German expressionism, of course, does not attempt to sort of recreate external what's there in nature, but reveals sort of the inner conflicts of the human being. And that becomes a sort of a new art, an art, by the way, which was condemned very much by Adolf Hitler later on in the Nazis. So you have them, and then you have a writer like Franz Kafka, for example. Franz Kafka writing brilliant novels. The earliest one, actually, Metamorphosis, novella, which was published in 1915, and that sort of the beginning of several themes that he'll be using later on. In the trial, we never learn who the person is that's on trial. His name is simply K. We never really learn what he's accused of. He never learns what he's accused of. He doesn't know why he's on trial. He thinks it's all a mistake. He's sure it's a mistake. He's sure that it'll be rectified. In the end, it turns out not to be a mistake. He is, in fact, sentenced, and his life comes to an end, and he never really understands exactly what has happened. That is fairly typical of the kind of art and the kind of novels, the kind of literature you're going to see in the 1920s. Thomas Mann, another one, Magic Mountain, magnificent, brilliant work, which is really about Hans Castorp, who ends up in a sort of, not asylum, but he ends up having to go into an institute for recovery from tuberculosis, it's a disease. And really it's about Europe. It's a metaphor for Europe and the suffering of Europe in the 1920s. And it seems that the disease is going to be fatal. So Mann turns out to be quite a pessimist, really, about the future as well. There were some, for example, Catholic philosophers who tried to find some sort of relief, who tried to find some sort of hope, who tried to project a better future. Jacques Maritain comes to mind immediately. Somebody who feels that it's very important to go back to the roots of Catholicism, right? It's very important to kind of resurrect a moral authority, a moral center, because man has lost his moral center. And that's typical of some of the Christian theology that you'll see. Reinhold Niebuhr, at one time one of my favorite authors many years ago, talks about that it's totally futile to think in terms of utopias, whether it's a nationalist utopia, whether it's a Marxist utopia, because there is no such thing as utopia. And the best that one can do is really to revert back to Catholicism, to restore the roots of Catholicism, to restore the moral center. And Reinhold Niebuhr argues that the human condition suffers from original sin, which it can't overcome, but which it can nevertheless do its best by simply restoring oneself back to Catholicism. So you have that. You have another kind of ideological alternative, and I'm thinking of Marxism, and of course there were a number of Marxists who are still around in the 1920s, 1930s. But what you'll see is as Russia or the Soviet Union hurtles into totalitarianism under Stalin, that there's going to be a more and more sort of aversion to Marxism, and so you begin to some people who actually had thought that there was a possibility of sort of renovation of Marx's ideas, an adaptation of the 20th century, like André Gide, Arthur Koestler. They changed their minds, particularly after the show trials, of course, in the late 30s in the Soviet Union, when so many of the earlier Bolsheviks are being led to their, taken into trial and then are executed by the Soviet state. So Marxism, you might say, becomes more and more discredited as a result of that. There were those who did try to find another tradition. For example, Herbert Marcuse, who eventually flees from Germany and comes to the United States and becomes renowned for his work in the 1960s. He tries to amalgamate or merge both Freud and Marx, and who really sees in Marx the possibility of human redemption, actually, or of human salvation, or human freedom. And the Freudian part of that is that mankind instinctually wants his freedom, and that the working class will instinctually fight for that freedom as part of class struggles. So he does try to sort of maintain the Marxist tradition even then. There are a number of other reactions. For example, some, including one of my own professors, John Weiss, who felt that the way to the future was through the past, and what they meant was a kind of return to the Enlightenment, the principles of the Enlightenment, which held essentially that sort of liberal principles, go back to those, which held that reason, if mankind would go back to reason and resurrect reason, and liberal values, and the defense of all those kinds of values, the freedom of the press, the freedom of expression, the freedom of conscience, and so forth and so on, that one could somehow attain human rights and base that on sort of principles of rationality. One of those, by the way, was Ernst Cassirer, who really was a Kantian, followed Kant, and believed that the only way forward for mankind was to understand that there were certain truths which were eternal and which applied to everybody in terms of defending human rights. And that was Cassirer. He was certainly not alone in that. There were others who felt that it was still possible to find the road of reason. One other thinker, person I used to read quite a bit myself when I was younger, Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher, he felt that in the age of sort of modern mass everything, mass communication, the massification, the masses, he felt that that civilization had somehow become debased, and I think to an extent what he was really critical of was democracy, was just sort of a leveling process, and I'm not so sure that he thought that was the way to go. He felt that the elites, that there were some who had made substantial contributions, they were the creators, and he feared that modern society was a sort of leveling down to the lowest common denominator. So there was that too. I think he would also say, well, we still have to appeal to reason, and we still have to look to the tradition of the Enlightenment. At least that was a central thought for a number of people. Finally, let me talk briefly existentialism, or existentialism back in the 50s and 60s and even earlier was the philosophy. Some, of course, dismissed it as not a philosophy, including one of my former professors, but for me and for so many others, it was an attempt to find meaning in life when in fact it was very difficult to say what meaning meant. And let me give you an illustration. One of the thinkers and novelists was Albert Camus, and he told the story of a Greek philosopher by the name of Diogenes Laertius, and the story goes like this, and this is in one of Camus' essays. The story goes like this. Diogenes Laertius is fishing in a bathtub. Somebody comes along and sees him fishing in a bathtub, and so he thinks he's going to humor him, and he says, well, how are they biting? How are the fish biting today? And Diogenes Laertius turns to him and says, what, are you crazy? This is a bathtub. That's the existentialist notion of absurdity. And what they are getting at, and one finds this in these very difficult abstract works like Sartre's Being and Nothingness, is that we live in an absurd universe. It's an absurd universe because we don't know where we come from. We're incidental, we're accidental. By no means are we the center of God's creation, and of course the atheist existentialists deny there's a God. And you find this whole notion, sort of the emptiness of the world, the accidental nature of human nature and where we come from. You find this sort of this universal skepticism. The universe is absurd. How do you really find life? How do you make life in an absurd world? Well, Sartre's answer to that, which some would accept and some would not, is that in an absurd world, you make the meaning. You are the meaning. You become the meaning, and your meaning is essentially what you decide to do. It becomes your project. So the world need not remain absurd. It's absurd only if you let it be absurd. It's absurd only if you think that there's meaning, only if there is a divine creation of some sort. And so what Sartre means to say is that we do not live in a purposeless world. It is purposeful, and that depends, however, on the individual finding that purpose, right? Project. And for Sartre, who later on actually embraces Marxism, for Sartre, that meaning can be communism, it can be some form of socialism, but it means that it's, in an absurd world, you actually become the creator of your own meaning. You are the meaning. And what you do is essentially what creates the significance of history itself. So that becomes a sort of the leitmotif. That becomes the motif of a number of other important existentialists, and there's many. Some are Christian existentialists. I mentioned Martin Heidegger, who's also well known for his relationship to Hannah Arendt, but is also known as the brilliant philosopher who joined the Nazi Party, and he actually did do that. If you read Being and Time, his central work, it's a brilliant work. It sounds as much as like poetry as it does philosophy, and it's really an attempt to find meaning also in a world which is absurd. And unfortunately, for Heidegger, that had something to do with Nazi philosophy, which he thought might actually help people find their own purpose as well. There's many other elements to his thinking. I didn't really see the connection when I read it, although I can certainly understand it now between his philosophy, and I understand why he eventually got to Nazism. But he did agree with Sartre. In fact, he very much influenced Sartre. He did agree with him in the sense that absurd world means you can still find meaning in it. There's still purpose in it. And in that sense, Heidegger is somewhat consistent with the other existentialist philosophies as well. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you, and we'll talk to you soon.